Before reggae, before ska, before rocksteady, before any of it, there was a radio signal crossing the Caribbean Sea. 3 specific radio stations, powerful clear-channel transmitters whose signals, on a clear night, could travel across the Gulf of Mexico and reach the hills and shanty towns of Jamaica with remarkable clarity. The people who caught those signals had no idea they were receiving the raw material for one of the most important musical traditions the 20th century would produce. This is Reggae Stories, and this is where it begins. To understand how reggae was born, you have to start earlier than most people expect. Not in the 60s, not in the recording studios of Kingston. You have to go back to the Jamaican countryside and to a music called mento. Mento is Jamaica's original folk music. Musicologists trace its roots to the late 19th century, a product, as ethnomusicologist Daniel T. Neely described it, of the colonial experience itself. It emerged from the working classes of Jamaica, blending West African rhythmic traditions brought over by enslaved people with European dance forms, English folk songs, and the musical exchange that came from Jamaican workers traveling to Cuba to cut sugar cane. Those workers returned with the marimbula, a large bass thumb piano that became the rumba box, the instrument that would give mento its distinctive low-end pulse. A typical mento band was small, acoustic guitar or banjo, hand drums, shakers, a fife, and the rumba box. Some performers played bamboo saxophones, literally saxophones carved from bamboo. The lyrics were sharp, humorous, socially observant, and often, by the standards of the time, scandalously rude. Former Jamaican Prime Minister Edward Seager, who researched the island's folk music extensively, described mento as a combination of music from Africa, English folk songs, and religious material that entered Jamaica after the American Civil War. By the 1940s, mento had reached the peak of its popularity. It was played at nightclubs like the Silver Slipper in Crossroads and the Glass Bucket in Halfway Tree. It was played at yard dances, weddings, market days, and street corners. It was the soundtrack of Jamaican community life. And in the 1950s, it became Jamaica's first commercially recorded music, pressed by entrepreneurs like Stanley Motta and Ivan Chin, who recognized there was a market for capturing this sound on disc. But mento was about to face a challenger it couldn't have anticipated, and that challenger was traveling at the speed of light. Literally, after the Second World War, Jamaica was changing at a pace that the island had never experienced. Thousands of Jamaicans who had served in the British military returned home to find limited opportunity. Meanwhile, the promise of city life drew rural Jamaicans to Kingston in large numbers. Neighborhoods like Trenchtown, Denhamtown, and Jonestown grew fast, filling with people who had left the countryside behind. They brought their stories, they brought their hunger, they brought mento. But in the city, something else was in the air. American military forces stationed in Jamaica during and after the war had brought radios and American records with them, and those powerful transmitters in Miami, Nashville, and New Orleans, the clear channel stations that could broadcast across enormous distances at night when atmospheric conditions were right, were reaching Jamaican ears with a sound that mento, for all its richness, simply hadn't prepared people for. Artists like Fats Domino, Louis Jordan, Roscoe Gordon, Smiley Lewis, and Shirley and Lee were making rhythm and blues that hit the body in a completely different way. Electric, urgent, built on a backbeat that moved before the brain could process it. The DJs on those stations, figures like Dr. Daddy O and Papa Stopper in New Orleans, and white DJs like Dewey Phillips in Memphis who, as researchers noted, talked with the energy of the black music they played, added a layer of performance and charisma that Jamaican listeners found electric. The problem was access. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, according to research published by San Jose State University, most working-class Jamaicans were too poor to afford radios. The big Jamaican bands that did exist tended to play hotels where ticket prices kept ordinary people out. And even if you had a radio, the Jamaican station, Radio Jamaica Rediffusion, only broadcast for a few hours a day and its signal faded after dark. This created the conditions for one of the most important inventions in the history of popular music. The sound system, not what the term means today. In late 1940s, Jamaica, a sound system was exactly what the name suggests, a system for producing sound, a record player, an amplifier, and speakers, sometimes built by hand, sometimes imported at enormous expense from the United States, representing roughly a year's wages for the average Jamaican worker, loaded onto a truck or cart and driven to wherever people gathered, yards, street corners, open fields. Operators like Clement Coxsone Dodd and Duke Reed built their first sound systems in the early 1950s. Duke Reed, a former police officer who ran a liquor store called the Treasure Isle on Bond Street in Kingston, held his first public sound system event in 1953. By 1961, his followers had crowned him King of Sound and Blues. In that same year, Reed himself crowned Fats Domino, whose piano technique and emphasis on the offbeat had become one of the defining influences on Jamaican music. As the king of rhythm and blues, the competition between sound systems was ferocious. Operators needed exclusive records, tracks that no rival had. This drove them to travel to the southern United States, sometimes under the pretense of being farm workers, to source the newest American rhythm and blues releases from shops in New Orleans, Miami, and Nashville. The Jamaica Gleaner reported that it became common practice for sound system operators to scratch the labels off their most prized records so that competitors couldn't identify and source the same music. That is how seriously they took the business of exclusivity. And it was a business, not just entertainment, a commercial ecosystem built on music as power, music as identity, music as competitive advantage. The culture of rivalry, exclusivity, and innovation that the sound system created would drive Jamaican music forward for the next 7 decades. By the late 1950s, a crisis was developing. American music was changing, rhythm and blues was evolving into rock and roll, and Jamaicans, as Clement Dodd himself stated in Kevin O'Brien Chang's book, Reggae Roots, didn't much like rock and roll. The hard R&B supply that kept the dance halls full was drying up. Dodd put it plainly. American music started to change from rhythm and blues to rock and roll, but Jamaicans didn't like rock and roll much. I searched the US, but the R&B supply was drying up, so I decided to record my own music at Federal Records. This decision, born of commercial necessity as much as artistic ambition, changed everything. Local musicians, many of them steeped in jazz and deeply familiar with American rhythm and blues from years of listening to those radio broadcasts and sound system dances, began working with operators like Dodd and Reed to create original Jamaican recordings. The earliest results were direct copies of the American shuffle blues style, but within 2 to 3 years, something was happening to the rhythm. The offbeat guitar chop, influenced by the piano technique of Fats Domino and by the rhythmic afterbeat that Mento had always emphasized, was becoming more prominent, more Jamaican, more itself. Theophilus Beckford's Easy Snapping, Laurel Aitken's Boogie in My Bones, Alton and Eddie's Muriel. These are some of the earliest recordings that reveal the transition, a music that was starting as American R&B and arriving somewhere distinctly Jamaican. The first ska recordings were made at facilities including Federal Records, Studio One, and YRL Records in Kingston, with producers Dodd, Reed, Prince Buster, and a young music industry entrepreneur named Edward Seeger, who would later become Prime Minister of Jamaica. And in 1962, the year Jamaica achieved independence from Britain, this new sound would explode. But that is a story for the next episode. What this episode has been about is a simpler and in some ways more profound point. Reggae, like almost every great popular music, didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a collision, from the encounter between Jamaica's own folk tradition and a radio signal that crossed the Caribbean at night, from poverty that made sound systems the only affordable entertainment, from commercial rivalry that drove men to scratch labels off records to protect their competitive advantage, from necessity that eventually forced those same men to stop importing music and start making it. The Miami radio signal that reached Jamaica, the mento rhythms that shaped how Jamaican ears heard that signal, the sound systems that gave working-class Jamaicans access to music that hotels and clubs denied them. These are the foundations. Everything else, ska, rocksteady, reggae, dancehall, is built on what happened in these years. Next episode, the Skater Lights, Prince Buster, and the explosion of ska in the year Jamaica found its independence.